This is Captivating Conversations Prison Poetry. I am JC Brain. I am the Visitor Services Coordinator at Old Idaho Penitentiary. I'll be moderating tonight. We're so happy that, everyone can join us, or if you're, viewing this at a later time, then we're happy to have you on board. Captivating Conversations is a bi-monthly lecture series that the Idaho State Historical Society operates at the Old Idaho Penitentiary, sometimes in person, sometimes digitally, depending upon what world we're living in, right? And so we hold this lecture series to invite folks who had connections to the Old Idaho Penitentiary, to the Idaho State Penitentiary, folks who can speak to topics ranging from prison reform to current correctional institutions to past issues that directly related to the Idaho State Penitentiary, or to exhibits and special events and programs that we're having at the Old Idaho Penitentiary. The Old Idaho Penitentiary does offer some programs that are operated by Idaho State Historical Society, some cool artifacts that live at the Old Idaho Penitentiary but aren't related. And occasionally we'll talk about those sorts of things. But yeah, this is I want to say the fourth instance of the Captivating Conversations lecture series. We're happy to have today Dr. Dora Ramirez, who's a professor of sociology, professor of ethnic studies in the Department of Sociology at Boise State University. Also happy to have local poet and educator Dona Ochoa out here, and we'll be talking to them momentarily. This subject, prison poetry, that we're discussing today was something we actually had originally planned for April, which is Prison Poetry Month, and it's just been postponed a little bit, but it's something that we still wanted to discuss and didn't want to leave hanging too long because of the current site's interest in the writings of the prisoners, the incarcerated men and women at the site. We just finished digitizing the Clock and the Wall City Bulletin, which are the prisoner written newspapers at the site. Toward the end of the site's lifetime, in the 60s and 70s, there was a periodical newspaper that was written by and published by the prisoners for circulation in the site. And it included poetry on a very regular basis, written by the men and the women at the site. There was a women's editor out of the women's ward, incarcerated woman who would serve in that function, who would report on the happenings going on out at the women's ward, which sometimes, they would be creative when the happenings weren't much, when they, report that that time is moving slowly and there wasn't much to do out there, but usually that was a great breeding ground for creativity and for expression of thought. And so, and same in the men's side of things. The women's ward was separated into a separate facility in 1905 and operated until 1968. And it came in a long tradition of course, prison memoirs, prison poetry. We can trace that from Oscar Wilde, through Angela Davis and Noel Sadawi. We can trace the lineage of the prison memoir almost through the history of incarceration, just because it's was usually the most accessible tool for folks to express themselves from behind bars and while in prison. It takes a pen and paper, and if those are available to you, then folks usually use them. And a lot of times those memoirs became standards in the historiography on the subject of incarceration and prisons, correctional institutions, reform, all those sorts of things. And so we're very happy to have Dr. Dora Ramirez here. I'm going to read her biography just as an introduction to you. So Dr. Dora Ramirez is a professor of ethnic studies at Boise State University in the Department of Sociology. She holds a doctorate in English from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and her research focuses on the way language creates polarization in a racialized society and contemporary United States culture. And Dr. Ramirez, I am going to lead the, I'm going to lend you the floor, but I do want to encourage anyone who's watching either via Facebook or through Zoom to submit questions through Zoom or through Facebook Live, and we'll be kind of keeping track of those questions throughout the lecture. Hi, Dr. Ramirez. I'm going to call you Dora as you.
I know. I'm like, call me Dora. That's what I always do. People, I'm always like, call me what you're comfortable with. Yeah. So I'm going to share a screen with you, but before that, thank you for having me here. I'm a little worried that I might be repeating things you already know, but I'm going to do a little history before I get to the reason why I think poetry, prison poetry especially, or prison narratives are important. My voice is gone since the smoke came, so let me know if you can't hear me, but let me share a screen. Go. One of the things that I find absolutely important in this world is to give access to underserved populations, access to education, access to writing, access to their voice, and access to understanding that what they have to say is important. And so I've always worked from that lens, including in my own education, and trusting myself that I have something to say, which a lot of writers have to learn, right? A lot of people have to learn that what they have to say is important. And so, one of the reasons that prison poetry, I think, is a genre that's becoming more and more acceptable, because for the longest time it was difficult to get these courses into prisons, that it's becoming more accessible as the public is understanding just how many people in our country go to prison, and then really trying to understand where education failed people that they think, the kind of person that goes to prison, right? Which is, you need to erase that from your mind, and we'll talk about that. So prisoner poetry is a source of ethnographic information on prison life. So as we receive more stories, as we get more stories, we understand what they are experiencing in prison, because we have a lot of shows, TV shows, that tell us this is what prison does to you, right? And then people just assume things that perhaps are not even real, right? And so we really need to know, like, where do the people stand? And what do they experience? And then prison poetry can move prison reform forward if the public is made more aware of what prison life does to the incarcerated person's mind and soul, to really understand that prison in this country is not something that reforms people. Prison in this country has moved way beyond that. So we need something that can do that. So how do we reform the criminal justice system with the information that we get from these stories? So it's a very ethnographic type of project, if you want to make it that, or it's just something where you're reading this and you're like, whoa, I did not know that, that was possible, right? So it's a genre, I think, that should receive more attention, especially right now when BLM conversations, Black Lives Matters, not BLM as in Bureau of Land Management, but Black Lives Matters is gaining more consideration, to really understand, like, why are BLM activists asking for the abolishment of the criminal justice system? And a lot of people don't understand that. I just threw this up there in case people don't know, but this is Idaho. So we have roughly 8,000 people in prison. And this is the amount of money that we do spend on prisons here in the state. So our cost per inmate is very low, and that's really where people should look. You know, what is the percentage of the budget that each state is using towards inmates? I think it's Louisiana that has the highest percentage and their average cost per inmate. So that's just something to think about there. I always say we're not too late. We as a state could reform our prison system here. So the history of the prison system in the US, you know, is something to consider, as especially as it focuses on the African American population as well as the working class population. And just recently with private prisons or private detention centers, the Mexican American or Mexican population, immigration, I should say, immigrants to this country. So 1852 is San Quentin was the first nonprofit, for-profit, not nonprofit, for-profit prison. Yeah, nonprofit prison, that's messed up. For-profit prison in the US. And then the complaints were made because of the way that they were using force to gain control of their prisoners, which means death, right? And so in 1858, the state assumed control, but they had to do that forcefully, which is interesting. I haven't looked into like that exact history or that moment, but I'm gonna do that because I'm like, that says a lot, right? So 1867 was the first state contracted convict leasing plan, and that was in Little Rock, Arkansas. And the reason I'm bringing in convict leasing is because, you know, in most schools you go from slavery to yay, the Emancipation Proclamation, and then yay, civil rights. And we forget much of those moments in history and that are still with us today, where slavery, I show this documentary all the time. It's called Slavery by Another Name. So slavery just becomes, it takes a different form. And convict leasing was one of those forms. In 1866 to 1912, 3,500 prisoners died in the system of convict leasing because, as many people said, many, you know, prison guards and those that were part of that system, they said, oh, you know, when you have slaves, you have to feed them, you have to take care of them. You actually want them to reproduce and have more slaves. Then convict leasing, who cares if they die? They just, you know, get a new convict. And this is the time period where, you know, a black man looks at a white woman funny, he gets arrested. You know, if you don't cross the street when a white person is walking towards you, you get arrested. And so right now we have call out culture and we have those Karens, and I forget the name for the guys, you know, we have those ideas of that. It has a historical significance in the sense of, you know, white woman saying, oh my gosh, this black man tried to kiss me, and then he goes to jail even if he didn't. Or, oh my gosh, you know, he looked at me funny. Or the man could say, you just exist, you know, let me find something that you did wrong even if you didn't, and take him to prison. You know, so it's a scary place to be as a person of color, especially with this system in place. And, you know, history, of course, continues. So in 1945, so this is after World War II began, the convict leasing system ended. And of course, there's a lot to be said there about needing people to fight the war. And so this was a time period where you had to, you know, the Japanese had to sign forms that said, I am, you know, all my loyalty goes to the US. African Americans didn't have to do that, but if they joined the military, it would show the same thing. And so there's a lot of racial, I don't know what to call it, issues, for lack of a better word, a lot of racial issues that are embedded within these laws, and finding them and kind of disentangling them from these moments is really important. And it leads to our prison system today. So I just put here in January 26th of this year, Joe Biden signed an executive order that will phase out the Department of Justice's use of private prisons. And this is important because private prisons can pay their prisoners to do work for corporations. So can state prisons. In Idaho, they don't pay their prisoners to do work. I had the law and I was like, wow, that's interesting. So that employment, which is not employment, it's servitude, is free, right? And so, so for the state prison, they're not going to make money, but they are going to use the labor free for the corporations. And so I'm like, that's even worse than at least paying the prisoner $1.60, I think it was at the highest, an hour. So we really have to think about what are private prisons for, and then how do state prisons mimic or use those same sorts of policies within their walls. You know, so why are so many people going to jail for maybe 1.01 ounces of marijuana? You know, and why do certain states not want to legalize marijuana? So it's all kind of tied together, and we'll get to that in a minute. So Nixon, the war on drugs, it wasn't Reagan, it was Nixon. Reagan just caught on. Nixon officially declared a war on drugs, stating that drug abuse was public enemy #1. But this interview with John Ehrlichman, I cannot say his name, his domestic policy chief, stated, so this is hurtful, right? He said, we know we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Clinton said things like this. Reagan has said things like this, and you can go look for them. They're not hard to find. And so you know it's racialized, and also it's about class. And so if you're, you know, white, working class, white labor class, white lower class, however you define yourself, but not middle class. And some middle class people are interesting because they're like, I'm lower middle class. I'm like, no, dude, you're working class. You know, it's like you are not lower middle class. Think about these things, you know, so 1977, we had a little bit of a respite. Jimmy Carter was able to decriminalize the possession of 1 ounce of marijuana. So that's where people can drive around, get caught with less than an ounce and be kind of okay. Unless they're actually smoking it at the time, then you get DUI, that's different. But you know, it's like, he was trying to decriminalize it completely. So this, I think, is the beginning of thinking about legalizing marijuana. 80s, Ronald Reagan, of course, Nancy Reagan, you know, that little fried egg, this is your brain on drugs, right? That scared me as a kid, right? I think it scared many people, and people were like, no, I don't do drugs, right? But what that did, even in my little nerdy mind, is vilified drugs. And people who know me from high school are like, yeah, Dora didn't do anything, right? And that's true, because Nancy Reagan, she ruined my life, but I didn't do anything. So Nancy Reagan began her campaign, Just Say No to Drugs, and it took off, right? Because parents, schools, you know, everybody had those signs up, everyone agreed, drugs are bad for you. But when we do that, and they're already, because of Nixon, connected to Black people, brown people, what we're also saying is say no to people who do drugs. And so slowly and slowly and slowly, that racism begins to just infiltrate our way of thinking about the world. And so he expanded Nixon's policies. 1986, we had the Anti-Drug Abuse Act that was passed by Congress. And this is where it began to be very specific and very racialized. And they knew what they were doing at this time. So 5 grams of crack would tend to be in, you know, urban, lower class urban areas. you would get a 5-year minimum sentence, and that equated to 500 grams of cocaine, which tended to be upper class drug, typically white. And also you would get a 5-year minimum sentence for that. So it's like crack, just a little bit of crack will get you 5 years. I was going to cuss, sorry. A ton of cocaine would get you, not a ton, but would get you a 5-year minimum sentence. And so you begin to see the race disparities come through again. So here is what happened because of that. You know, there was a rapid rise in incarcerations for nonviolent drug offenses from 50,000 in 1980 to 40,000. And if you've ever seen, I forgot the name of the 13th Amendment, you see the numbers, and it's an older documentary, but the numbers just grow so quickly. It's amazing. And in 2014, half of the people serving time in the US are due to drug-related charges, most of them nonviolent drug offenses. So this is a huge population of our prison system. We could save a lot of money and we could help a lot of people by reforming it. So these are the effects of the war on drugs: criminalization of drug users, excessive level of imprisonment, punitive sentencing practices. And it directly impacts the vulnerable, the poor, socially excluded groups, including ethnic minorities and women. And if you see how quickly women jails were filling up, it's really interesting to me to look at that aspect as well. That could be a whole show for you, you know, because what it does is it separates families, even taking away the father or the mother from the mother, you know, depending on your setup, you know, it separates you from your family. And you are also in communities usually that lack support. So there's that aspect as well. And this is more current statistic. A number of people incarcerated in state and federal prisons and local jails dropped from around 2.1 million, this is COVID, in 2019 to 1.8 million by mid-2020, a 14% decrease, excuse me. So this decline held through the fall. And I just added a chart. I'm not gonna go to that chart, but it really shows you where the offenses are placed, you know, whether it's nonviolent drug offenses to violent offenses, not drug related, just murder, that kind of thing. And I thought that was interesting with COVID. You know, people were really watching systems during COVID. That's one positive thing I think that happened, because people really opened their eyes to how these systems affected them and their families and their communities. So Biden this year has the opportunity to lessen the effects of the war on drugs, you know, by deciding how fentanyl, opioids, and marijuana will be categorized. And if you think about opioids, which tend to be, it's a joke, but tend to be white women and middle class, it probably will be Schedule 2 because it's also used for medical use, and that's typically where the addictions start, you know. So it's very interesting to me because it's a slippery thing. But marijuana right now is Schedule 1 category, right there with heroin. We'll see what happens, because I think Biden was trying to make marijuana nationally legal in all states, you know, but it's going to be, I forgot what it was, age restricted to 18, but also they have to think about the medical use for that drug. And so with both decisions, you have class implications and racial implications, right? Just like crack and cocaine. And so it's something to watch and think about. And I think it's interesting because I'm always looking at that stuff. But so private prisons, right, versus public prisons. ICE, you know, detains over, ICE detains immigrants in over 200 detention centers, and these are privatized. So what we're doing is moving back to the convict, I call it convict slavery, convict leasing system, And we're not really watching. We're not watching because we think of immigrants as different than slaves, or different than, the poor populations in the US. And we tend to separate them from ourselves. And so with detention centers, we really need to think about, like, where are these kids? I saw something on Instagram, and it was really heartbreaking because it said, in the same way that we're finding all these bodies in the boarding schools, what is our country going to say when we find all the bodies of the children that are missing near detention centers? And so when we talk about family separation, we have to think about, like, what does that mean to the US and its racialized history? That's a whole, paper I can write. But ICE used more than $3 billion in taxpayer dollars to fund the detention of nearly 170,000 immigrants. And the average time that they spend in detention is growing and growing because we have a backlog because of many things, so 81% of people detained in ICE custody nationwide were held in facilities owned or managed by private prison corporations. And so I think it's important to really understand that, and down at the bottom that my little screen thing is blocking, it talks about COVID rates, to really think about, like, how fast it spread amongst the populations in prisons and in detention centers. It's really important to think about that. And I'm kind of stuck. What happened? Let's see. There we go. Okay, so into poetry, right? One of the things that Michelle Alexander, who wrote the New Jim Crow, which is a great book about prison reform, she starts by saying, it is the prison label, not the prison time, that defines a person for the rest of their life, and so thinking about that is where poetry comes into play, and allowing people to move outside of their labels is really important. And so when I talk about prison poetry, it goes back to that history. And I say abolition, is about mutual aid. Abolition imagines a world without policing. Can we imagine another world system at work? I don't know, and a lot of people can't. And that's where the kind of fighting begins against abolitionists. In the same way that during slavery, or right at the end of the laws, right, a lot of people couldn't imagine a world without slavery. It just didn't compute. But we're still in a world with slavery. That's how much it didn't compute, right? So we are embedded in our social imaginations in a world that can only work under surveillance. So a lot of people think that they have to control other people in order for a society to function. This goes from corporations to small businesses to parents and their kids to, all that kind of stuff, to prisons. And so for those that feel it is working, right, surveillance, and is a safe place, and that's what we call privilege. Poetry, though, and one of the things being a professor is I've taught in Nebraska and Texas and New Mexico, here, Oregon. I've seen the kind of people who come to me with poetry in their minds, and it's always people who hate grammar. They don't think they can write, and they really overthink their world. So, they really think about the world and what is happening in it, right? And they're thinkers. Doesn't mean that they have the best grammar. I heard, who was it? Oh, I can't remember who it was. She does a poetry prison workshop in New York. Can't remember her name, but she says she went into the prisons and they have this beautiful rhythm to the way that they speak, and it was in their poetry, right? And that happened to me when I went to Texas. I'm like, man, you sound like home, right? And I never read that, of course, and the poetry I read for poetry classes. but their poetry sounded like home. And they're like, yeah, I hate writing, but I like doing poetry. It's like music, right? So they have these ideas of what it is. So poetry is an outlet where those that are marginalized in communities and that are threatened by this surveillance, right? Surveillance also can be like, you need a complete sentence with a period here and a comma here, right? Can then have the space to let their imaginations think of other ways to police communities. And so it's all tied together in ways that are important. So I hope I'm not going over, I will probably. So community helps each other meet basic survival needs because the system does not help these communities. So this is about mutual aid, right? So mutual aid, so like a poetry workshop in a prison is not a symbolic act. You know, I know a lot of people that say, why are you going to go teach in a prison? You just want to feel better about yourself. I'm like, nah, that's not it. You know, if that's what you do to feel better about yourself, I don't know, you know, but a lot of people go in there because it's important, right? To offer people that voice, but also to give them that sense of pride in their own selves. So mutual aid is not a symbolic act. It puts pressure on government representatives and builds social relations within the community. You know, so if you go in there and you treat people like they're worth teaching, you know, because many people don't think that they're good enough for college. I've heard that so many times in my own community, like, I'm not good enough to go to college. I'm like, who told you that, right? Some surveillance person, right? That's trying to, you know, block certain people from college. I'm like, who told you that? They don't belong in college, right? That's my whole thing. I'm always, it's not me, it's you, right? But that really irks me because I'm like, who says who can do what, right? I think it's the individual, but also communities can help build that. So mutual aid projects are also volunteer-based, and to me, this one's important. Mutual aid makes state-sanctioned coercion and violence visible to the public. So by doing these poetry workshops in prison and getting those voices out, we understand the stuff that they're going through, right? The stuff that put them there, the stuff that they think will get them out, the things they have to go through there. And so, you know, what I put here was COVID and BLM protests in 2020. The only way that we knew about what was happening with Black lives was by the visual representation of video, right? And that's a story. Before we had poetry, we had writing, now we have video, you know, so these arts are all important in that way. So I already talked a little bit about this, but they do aid in helping prisoners feel less isolated. Juno Diaz, who teaches prison workshops in New York, Angela Davis, who writes about prison because she was in it all the time, talks about the ideas of feeling less isolated because prison is lonely. So they connect writers' thoughts, messages, and knowledge about prison life to the outside public. And I just talked about this, but this is a book that Angela Davis wrote. Well, she wrote it while she was in prison with Bettina Aptheker, and it has sold millions of copies. So if you want to read about prison reform, you might want to check this out, you know, if they come in the morning. And Aptheker said, the fundamental assertion that prison makes is the isolation of the prisoner, sequestered in a hidden world and deprived of rights. Whether or not a prisoner is remembered or eventually freed, the state constructs an inhuman drama of inside and outside, dividing and damaging the communities that naturally exist among people. So this poetry can come out and say, you know, I am human. I'm not inhuman just because I'm in prison, which would allow for the kind of, you know, reformation or that kind of sense of like, you know, prison is actually working, you know, to help people, not just to further isolate them or further make them inhuman, right? Which a lot of prisoners are treated that way when they get released. especially in trying to find a job, you know. So so here are some things that are important in that sense, is that this type of writing can be seen as therapy. I just put bibliotherapy there because that's what it's called. But what it does is it helps a person better understand their own feelings, but also connect it to other people's feelings. So that idea of empathy. So here, you know, looking at characterization. So like if I see a person, a lot of us project, right? We project who we think that person is, but that's not who that person is. So poets and fiction writers have to really get into that other character to understand who they truly are as much as you can. In comparison to you, because you're the writer, right? So you're the only one that can understand that relationship. And by understanding somebody else differently from who you are, you begin to build that empathy. Same thing with the single word, you know, so just by saying, oh, that criminal is dirty, that's heavy meaning versus that criminal had a difficult experience in their home, right? So it's like a different way of understanding what is happening with that criminal, because the word criminal, as you know, Angela Davis and them talk about, is filled with meaning, negative meaning, that we're unwilling to see in a different way. So we ourselves, you know, as a public, I talk generally, need to reevaluate what we think criminal or prisoner is. You know, that's why Michelle Alexander always says, how about we use the incarcerated person or the formerly incarcerated person, right? To remove that idea of prisoner, criminal, negativity. So I try to use it, right? So for a disenfranchised, incarcerated, or formerly incarcerated person, poetry can help them reach that understanding of themselves. It can also educate the public about things that we don't want to think about, right? Or give our needed attention to. Like, I don't want to think about the fact that women are in prison with their children. The child did nothing, right? And she probably did nothing either. She was probably just trying to protect herself. But, you know, I don't want to think about that because I'm here at home with my latte, right? And I'm happy. I'm just a little hot, right? Because that's my life, right? And so we need to think about those kinds of things. ACLU is doing a lot. I know that they worked on a case, or are working on a case of a woman in Kootenai who was shackled while giving birth just because she's a criminal, or, you know, that kind of a thing, a prisoner. And so there's so much that we don't know, that if we knew, we probably wouldn't be allowing that to happen in our world, right? So it does lead us to thinking about how we're interconnected, how our actions relate to someone else. Those writing behind the walls of a prison can also think about, or rethink their actions, you know, and how it affected other people, and that sort of a thing. So Luis Rodriguez also gives it another spin. He was, well, if you've ever watched La Vida Loca, but if you've read Always Running, it's a book about his gang days, you know, and he went to prison because of that. But he reached a really low point where he wanted to commit suicide after he was in prison. And he said, and he tells his students in his prison poetry class, he said, as long as you have a song in your heart, in your head, you're not going to die. So he always said that poetry saved his life. You know, so if you can see the beauty or the connections to other people, you're probably not going to die. You know, you're not going to go through that. I won't read this because of time, but Jimmy Santiago Vaca is my favorite. He's awesome. And he was in prison. He had a pretty rough childhood. But this lends itself to isolation. This lends itself to understanding that you are loved. You know, I've watched too many TikToks, so now when I say you are loved, it's too much, right? My sarcasm comes through. But I'm like, you are loved, but everyone is loved. But for people to remember that they're loved, he wrote this both to himself and to those that he hurt. You know, and so I think it's important to understand that that there's ways to connect even after you've done something that hurts people. There's ways to connect. And then this is these are some resources that I'll share this with you, JC, but these are some resources. And if you just want to type in the names into your Google search, you'll see a lot. Aid to Abolition is awesome because it gives you actual action items that you can do to help reform the criminal justice system. I love that site. But then ACLU is, they're just gods, you know, in my book. So everything is ACLU. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Dr. Ramirez, thank you so much. You actually, you covered most of my questions. One of the things I was going to ask you was, are there certain communities or demographics that you've seen benefit from writing programs, and just because it does seem like a lot of the best known memoirs, poetry come from those underserved communities. I know certainly, not just the African American communities and things like that, but also like the LGBT community. There's some great writing out there based on their experiences, especially during the HIV epidemic. And so I'm gonna pick one question then, and then out of my one, and then I'll introduce our other guest. And that's just what led you to have a specific interest in poetry in relation to incarceration.
Yeah, so my community, I guess. And so like I'm from Nissa, Oregon. I'm not saying everyone goes to jail, but there's a large math problem, right? But then there's also, it's a lower class community. And so watching people that I know and love work through the criminal justice system, especially women, right? And thinking about how abuse is pretty rampant because of drugs, also because of poverty. Poverty makes you a little crazy sometimes, right? But like, watching that just kind of hit me. I remember having I have a friend, she's still my friend, in New Mexico, who's community similar to Nissa in the poverty range. She's like, yeah, my cousin stole my grandma's garage doors. And I'm like, what? It was both funny and not funny, but it's a story to tell about her. Her cousin stole her grandmother's garage doors. I was like, why? She's like, because he needs money for meth, right? And I was like, whoa, but it was funny and not funny, right? But it's a story that I think if you were to write it, a lot of people would be going, oh my gosh, I remember when so-and-so did that and so-and-so did that and so-and-so did that, right? And then we could talk about those kinds of things. And so writing and reading to me has always been an escape. And I always thought of it as an escape, but slowly as I moved into activism, I began to see the power of it. So I do it with Storyfort. I help Bovet of Idaho, which is an immigration rights group. I help people that want to tell their story about immigration, write them down, work through them, workshop them, and then present them at a Storyfort event. And we've had, standing room only kind of events where people come and listen to these stories that they had no clue. Half of them are like, I had no clue, that there's an infant who has to go to court by themselves without any representation, right? And so like, they're just like, what? I'm like, and so those stories kind of humanize, they humanize things that, issues that we have tried to separate ourselves from because it's heavy material. And so to me, that's always been of an interest. And now with my activism, I'm more and more and more seeing the importance of these stories and allowing the people who actually experience it to write it, not the academic, right? Like if you haven't experienced it, I'm like, you probably shouldn't be writing about it, or even you can study it, right? But like, I think the people who experience it should write it. But if they can't, then the academic can come in and help them, right? Which is me, I guess. So, but I never write people's stories. I let them write it, and then I help, you know, make it fit that form of surveillance, as I call it. You know, but so yeah, I'll keep talking. So stop. Donna knows. I just
Thank
keep
you,
talking.
Dora. You.
Oh, Jason, you froze.
Dora, am I frozen?
Yeah, you're like freezing.
Can you
There you are.
can you guys hear me and see me now? Doing okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to introduce Dona Ochoa, who's one of my colleagues at the Old Idaho Penitentiary, and we're going to take this last kind of 10-15 minutes to go back to the clock and the Wall City Bulletin a little bit, and as well as Donna's own experience as a local poet, and share a couple of these historic pieces as well as a personal contribution. So let me grab my my intro really quick for you, Donna. I like to do the intro in you guys' words. So Dona Ochoa is a poet and one of the founders of Boise Spoken Word Collective, which aims to share and highlight community voices in a safe space. They take inspiration from Idaho's natural environment and combine modern concerns and observations with natural imagery. Donna is currently working on projects with Boise Spoken Word and compiling a book of their poetry to share with the world. Thank you, Donna. I'm going to turn it over to you. Yeah, take our last time here. I will mute my.
Great. Thank you so much, JC and Dora. I loved everything you said, and I resonate with so much of it. And especially while reading through and trying to find these 3 selected poems from the clock, I kept this in mind. And just to circle back, you mentioned how these poems are the ones that feel most like home. They're not kind of soaked in the academy. They're very much like this person's experience of this place and how they're processing through it. So the first one I'm going to start off with is actually called Complaining Street. It's by an inmate named C.R. Johnson. I couldn't find their exact inmate number, but this is written by a male inmate in the clock. And so, Complaining Street. There's a family that nobody likes to meet. They live, it is said, on Complaining Street. In the city of never are satisfied, the river of discontent runs beside. They growl at that and they growl at this. Whatever happens, there's something amiss. And whether their station is high or humble, they are always known by the name of Grumble. The weather is always too hot or too cold. Summers and winters alike, they sold. Nothing goes right with the folks you meet down on gloomy Complaining Street. They growl at the rain and they growl at the sun. In fact, their growling is never done. And if everything pleased them, there isn't a doubt they'd growl that they'd had nothing to grumble about. And the worst thing is, if anyone stays among them too long, he will learn their ways. And before he learns of the terrible jumble, he's adopted the ways of the family of Grumble. So it is wisest to keep your feet from wandering down Complaining Street, and never growl whatever you do, lest you be mistaken for a grumbler too. And of course, I'm now connecting all of these poems to what Dr. Ramirez said, Dora, because the connection of this is, I feel like, pretty plain, but there's so much to complain about, but there's also so much to be grateful about. And it seems like a lot of the themes of these inmates' poems centered around this idea that there's so much negativity to feed into here, especially, so I'm going to try my best to not give in. Now, this second one was written by a woman inmate. It's called Search for a Soul. And in the clock, they only did first initials and last names. So I've got L. Lytle, but this was from the women's corner of the clock. So Search for a Soul. I wander along the byways of life as I search for mortal's goal. For a man must find his inner self to give peace to a troubled soul. As I go along these paths of time, I question the purpose of life. Must we travel on in this world of woe, ever fighting the onslaught of strife? There are those things I can't accept. There are things that oft torment me. My mind is a rudderless ship alone, adrift on a stormy sea. Thoughts come so fast I cannot hear the message they try to bring. Unchanneled and vague, they're churning free, no rhythm to the song they sing. If I go on to my dying day, burdened with care and grief, I can only hope my grave will be a tomb of eternal peace. Search for a Soul. All right. And this last one was from, this is from the 70s. The old penitentiary was only open until 1973. And there were multiple prison riots in the 70s, in that last little chunk that the old penitentiary was open. When I found this one, I felt it was really, really telling of where this inmate, but also probably a decent amount of the inmates here were at mentally and emotionally. And this is titled The Black Sheep, and it's by the inmate Ralph Lopez. There stood an old oak tree by the side of the road until one morning, late in the spring, I passed that way to see a vision of beauty. The fresh green leaves, bejeweled with heaven's dew, and my heart went wild as the heart of a child, as I suddenly thought of you. You say there is naught in your life worthwhile, and 'tis only a bubble at best. But listen and hear it because it is true. There's so much of the good that is left. It needs but the touch of the master's hand to create new life and desire, with an effort, of course, on your part to rekindle and ignite dead fires. Then why not take courage and put with faith on the fight and new hope to begin, and stick through the dark days as well as the light. If you do, my brother, you will win. And I selected those largely because they all have this tone of optimism, even though we have historical evidence that they were experiencing a lot of really, really hard things, especially at this penitentiary. I mean, there was a cell block that was still in use up to the 70s that did not have plumbing. The consistent complaint from the inmates was that it was overcrowded, uncomfortable. And the fact that this was an outlet for them as a way to be like, all this is happening, but all I can do is look forward. Because to quote my mom, all roads lead out of this place. And I think that's really, really poignant, especially just reading through these and doing my research. So I would like to take a second to share my own work. This is something I wrote last year in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of everything happening. This was my way to kind of understand and process and make sense of what I was feeling. And this is titled Excavation. So, number one, how far down must we dig to get these roots out? I don't want to see their buds pop back up in a year. These weeds are strangling the flowers and taking their life for an expansion I can no longer ignore. 2, the winds of change whip trees violently. all bowing toward the east. Leaves flip to show their matte undersides, lighter green and usually unseen here. Everyone is too busy carrying on to sit underneath oak and maple branches. Hair whips into knots and people become nauseated at the thoughts of things changing or staying the same for much longer. The catalyst has sparked and we speak names in mourning, call for changes in an unjust system, the waving of signs and acts of resistance in the name of acceptance of difference. Make this breeze turn turbulent. There are so many of us acting, yelling, paying, hoping, praying that these timely gusts lift up what has been loosened and carry it away, out beyond where we all are. If it's time for the poisoned, dying tree to be uprooted and removed before it kills us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. I want to ask you, is there anything that is coming up with the Spoken Word Collective that folks can go to, or in publications or anything like that that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so we are currently working on doing a small workshop for the months of August and September, inviting any level of poet to come in and work with us to, feel more confident in their work. We are all kind of under the same, we all operate under the same idea of this isn't about us. This is about creating a safe space for those in our community who want to share their voice. So providing them any tools we've picked up along the way is how we can show support to our community. So look out on our Instagram page. It's at Boise Spoken Word. We're also on Facebook, same thing. And we'll be posting in the next couple weeks about links, dates, times for those workshops. And then hopefully, with the way things are going in the world, we're going to try to do either a virtual spoken word night, or while it's still nice outside, maybe do a distanced outdoor spoken word event, because that's how we started. We started at Lost Grove doing monthly spoken word nights. So we're hoping we can get something going, but everything's so up in the air with the pandemonium. So yeah, that's what we've got going, and really excited. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And my hope is, I'll take this last minute to just say a couple things. My hope is that that we'll in April of next year, during Poetry Month, we'll do something at the site. We used to do poetry kind of competitions on the subject. I'd love to see maybe something where our staff or volunteers recite the poems of the people who were at the Idaho State Penitentiary in character. There's lots of ideas that I have, so kind of look out for that, and we'll talk more. But I also want to say I'll reach out to Dora and Donna, and we'll put together kind of a suggested reading list to post on social media if you guys are okay with that. Maybe just things that either we've mentioned or poetry anthologies, memoirs, things like that we recommend to folks, and we'll put something together for social media. Also, I'll post over the next week the poems that Donna had, the clock poems that Donna recited as well, so that folks can have another deeper look at that. So thank you so much to everyone who tuned in tonight. We really appreciate it. looking forward to another captivating conversation here at the end of August. Thanks, everybody.